Brian, if I'm going to believe in God, I have to believe that the characteristics of God make sense, that they cohere together, they don't contradict, that I have confidence in the combination of characteristics. And one thing I hear is that God has to be not only all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, but has to be perfectly free. That's harder to understand. What does it mean for God to be perfectly free?
There are three parts to what you might mean by saying that God is perfectly free. First, God is the source of his own actions. Nothing causes him to act, nothing coerces him to act. He just acts because he wants to, not because anything is imposed on him from outside. Second, God is in complete control of his actions. Nothing causes him to do one thing rather than another. Nothing affects his execution, so to speak. What he wants to happen, he's able to make happen, and he does. Third, God has significant alternatives. He doesn't have just one thing he could do. He has many possibilities, and he chooses among them.
Okay, now what you've not said is that God can do everything. Because God cannot do everything, right? I mean, God can't do impossible things.
Right.
Are there impossible things that God can't do?
God can't make a round square. God can't make 2 and 2 add up to 5. God can't make there be married bachelors. There are all sorts of things God can't do. Where my view differs perhaps from some others is that I don't think these are external limits imposed on God. I don't think God can't make unmarried bachelors, because there is somehow hanging out there in Platonic heaven the property of being a bachelor, and it just includes being unmarried, and so God can't make a married bachelor because the property hems him in, so to speak. I think the only limits on God are limits he himself imposes. So if there can't be married bachelors, that's because God has determined what it is to be a bachelor and set it up that way.
And if God decides that he wants married bachelors?
Given how he has set up the property of bachelors, it doesn't make sense to talk about unmarried bachelors. There just can't be such a thing.
So if it's impossible for God to have married bachelors the way he has set things up, it would sound like that's a constraint on God.
It's a self-imposed constraint, if that's so. I'm not saying
But God cannot unself-impose it.
Given that he's made it necessary that it be so, he can't.
It seems like you've made that a time sequence, which I don't think you want to do.
I wouldn't want to do that. You're right. All I was saying was things actually have this characteristic. Actually, as things are, it is necessarily the case that bachelors are unmarried. Given that God has brought it about that actually this is how things are, he can't make a married bachelor. He's imposed that limitation on himself.
Any other limitations?
Logic is the broad heading for that sort of limitation. Mathematics, I think, has the same structure. In other words, given 2 and 2 make 4, God's brought that about. It can't be otherwise, and couldn't have been otherwise. Also, I think his goodness imposes significant constraints on him. If God is perfectly good, then he can't make an overall evil universe. It may be that if he's perfectly good, such a thing isn't even really genuinely possible.
What does that mean, it's not genuinely possible?
It means that we certainly have the idea of an overall bad universe. We can think to ourselves of a universe in which there are nothing but little bunny rabbits who just suffer horribly for no reason at all, pointlessly forever. That would be a bad universe. We have the idea. But it may be that if God is genuinely perfectly good, it's not even possible that things be that way, because God necessarily exists and necessarily imposes his own moral character on the way things are. And so in no way things could be is it the case that a perfectly good God makes the bad bunny rabbit world.
Okay, and certainly God can't sin, can't go out of existence. I mean, these are other limitations on God's freedom.
Right, right.
Let's look at the nature of God in God's own self. You believe God is not in time, so that means God doesn't change.
Right.
So if God doesn't change, when we say not change, that doesn't mean change your mind. That means Immutable, that means...
That means nothing he actually is, he will ever come to be in any other way.
Okay, so that's a powerfully radical immutability,
Right.
unchangeability. That's stronger than a granite block in terms of unable to change. So how could a granite block be free?
Okay, it's a good question. You could sort of make it more precise by saying, how could a granite block have had a free choice about anything? What I'd want to say would be something like this. God actually is immutably such that, for example, he has made a world with dogs in it. That always was the case. It can't come to be otherwise. But it was up to him what would be immutably true of it. In other words, he could instead have made it the case that he was immutably such that he had made a universe which was otherwise with respect to dogs. There was no time at which he hadn't made that choice that he actually has made, but atemporally it could have been otherwise.
So there's no time difference between when God decided and this immutable fact. There's no time, because God's outside of time, and time didn't exist at that point anyway.
Right. But his decision is such that it could have been otherwise, although there was never a time at which it was, so to speak, unresolved.
So obviously we have difficulty, if not impossibility, to understand it, but I'm going to pretend to understand it. I'm going to pretend to understand it and ask you this question then. There was this explanatorily prior decision that God then, for all eternity, made the decision to have a universe with dogs. So after God made that decision, God then, from that point on, is no longer free because God's immutable decision had been made. Maybe God was free to make that decision in some strange way, which I don't quite follow, but I'll give you that. But certainly after that, there's no more change.
First, I want to take another stab at saying what it is for God's decision to have possibly been otherwise. What I wanted to say is this. God has decided that there will sooner or later be dogs. But it could have instead been this way. At all times, God has timelessly decided that there not ever be dogs. So that's the sense in which he was, quote, able to do otherwise. It's not like he could ever switch from things being one way to being the other way, but it could have just been the case that for all time, timelessly, it was the other way.
Fine, but then God is not free after that timeless decision one way or the other to do something different. Not free. I'm free. I can make a decision to do something different. God can't.
Okay. In what you said, there was just one key word, and that's the word after. You wanted to say after God has made the decision, he's not free. If God is atemporal, there's no after anywhere in his life. Okay. There's just the instant, so to speak, at which he decides everything he decides. So it's not like there's ever a later point at which his freedom has been reduced.
Okay. So we have to understand God in that instantaneous atemporality, that eternal atemporality where all is happening in that instant, not at the same time, because there is no time.
Right. Right.
And so it then doesn't make sense, you're saying, to say what I said, which is that God is not free to change his mind because God doesn't exist on this temporal scale.
Right. The question of losing your freedom after you decide only arises for beings that are in time.
Yeah. I mean, at least for our minds, it sounds like not only is God not able to change like the granite block, but God is a granite block and is this immutable thing. It strikes one as so bizarre that it's hard to conceive.
I'd say the majority of philosophers today don't believe that God is outside of time, and it's because of difficulties like this that they don't. So, you're expressing valid intuitions and ones that persuade a lot of people.
But not you.
Right.
But how important is the concept of freedom, that God has this perfect freedom?
You can take that question two ways. Is it important that God be free, and is it important that God be perfectly free? Certainly it's important that God be free. If God had no choice about the way the universe went, then maybe there was no other way the universe could be than the way it is.
And you wouldn't need a God.
And we wouldn't be free either.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's only one way the universe can be, we can't make our choices differently. So God's freedom is necessary to safeguard our own. That's one way to look at it. As to whether God needs to be perfectly free, well, if you hold that God is a perfect being, you don't want to say that anything about him is imperfect. So if you think the latter claim, that God is perfect, is an important one, then you're going to want to have to say that there's some respect in which his freedom is also a perfection.
What's the difference between God being free and God being perfectly free?
We are free, but not perfectly free. We can make some choices, but we have limits imposed on us from outside ourselves. So our freedom is imperfect. If God's freedom is perfect, then it's free from the limitations that sort of limit our freedom. And so, for example, while some things can constrain our choices from outside ourselves, nothing outside God constrains God's choices. That sort of thing is the difference.